everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Like Stars podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Pete Goodman. Grateful to have you joining with us on this fifth episode. I got a few things that I've been doing and working on I want to let you know about, and then we're going to continue to dive into the questions that you guys have been asking. The first thing is something new for this week, it's just kind of getting shifted, is because of just some of the feedback I've been getting and other requests from you guys, we started a YouTube channel. And by we, I mean me. I don't know why I said we. I started a YouTube channel. And on that YouTube channel, you can actually watch the podcast. So I'm doing some filming, video filming for them now. And you can also check out some other classes and content I've done. There's a whole section on there on a Gospels class, my faith workshop, as well as some messages I've taught in the past on different topics. I'm even in the middle of doing a teaching with our Rise City AIM ministry, where we're walking through really looking at the idea of apologetics for kids. So you can check out those 15, 18-minute videos on the YouTube. You don't have to be part of the ministry to watch them. We talked about critical thinking last week, and this week the idea of tolerance and intolerance and things. So yeah, jump on our YouTube page and you can check it out. Now, here's the thing about the YouTube page, and you guys probably know this, because it just got started and it's just me, I couldn't get the little, like stars word. Instead, it's, 479 HRQ, whatever. So I need you guys to get on YouTube and subscribe to it. I guess we need like 100 subscribers before I can change it to YouTube /like stars. So the way to find the YouTube, there's a couple of ways. Number one, there's a link to it on the podcast home. You can also find it on my social media, on my Instagram, Pete Goodman 1978, or my Facebook. And I'm posting, there'll be little clips and different things that are posted throughout the time. So there'll definitely be links available. And I also, just for something brand new, I also put together just kind of a quick homepage landing website for the podcast so people can find the content. And that is likestars.us, where you can find just quick links to the YouTube podcast and some other stuff. So love to have you check that out and subscribe. And also with this podcast, please subscribe, share, push the little like buttons, whatever, because that's what kind of gets it going and helps other people find it. So today, I want to continue some of the discussions we've been talking about in the first few episodes about just answering your questions. We took a whole bunch of questions at our church service a few weeks ago, and I've been working through them. Took a little break last week when we kind of talked about Daniel and why I wanted to change all the Like Stars content and name and everything. But this week, I want to get back to your questions. Before we do, I'll let you know that the Like Stars podcast now is sponsored, because I got to make that paper. That was the dumbest thing I've ever said. No, really. So today I have a special, really excited about this sponsor. This episode of Like Stars is brought to you by kale. That's right, kale. The food that finally answers the theological question that you and I have always been asking: what would Satan eat? Kale. It is truly evil. And it's our sponsor for episode 5. All right, let's dive in. Let's answer your questions and just see where this one goes. All right, you with me? Here we go. All right, here's the first question for today. Somebody wrote in and asked me this: why are there no current day prophets? Why are there no current day prophets? And this is a really good question. And it's got a lot in both the Old and New Testament that we need to work through. So first, before we answer the exact question, I want to take a step back and just talk about what is a prophet and what do we mean here. So the word prophet is a word that refers to a person who hears from the divine. And the word prophet isn't a specifically Christian or Jewish word. It existed in other cultures. But the Jewish people obviously believed there were prophets who heard from the one true God, Yahweh. Now, what's important to know about that is a prophet was a person who was getting information directly from God and giving it to the people. Like, to prophesy means to say what God is saying. And so in the Old Testament, the prophet was a very important figure. The prophet would be the person who the whole nation of Israel would look to and say, well, what does God want? What is God saying to us? And the prophet was responsible to hear from God for the people. And let's just keep that in mind. The prophet was responsible to hear from God for the people. The prophet was also responsible to hold the king accountable, to make sure the king was doing what he was supposed to do and leading people the way he was supposed to lead. So the prophet was a spiritual leader, but also a political leader. And when there was no king, it was the prophet like Samuel who would rise up and lead the whole nation, the people. Now, what we see in the Old Testament is this idea of a prophet, a person who is hearing from God, seemed to kind of fade at some point. And you come to this moment where you essentially, the Old Testament, quote unquote, ends, or at least, for collecting books, where they kind of believed the last prophet wrote the last thing they heard from God. And you then move into what was called the intertestamental period, between testaments, Old and New Testament, a few hundred years there between the last book of the Old Testament and the arrival of Jesus. And the Jewish people there was this general feeling that prophecy had kind of gone away. Now, that wasn't necessarily true, but it was kind of the overarching theme. And in its place, a different person had risen up and stepped in to fill the void of the prophet in a different way. And that person was known as a scribe, a writer, or a teacher. So in the intertestamental, the couple hundred years leading up to Jesus, prophets, these figures that were hearing from God and leading the people, sort of seemed to disappear. And in their place rose up these men who were scholars. They would study the writings of the prophets. So they would read and learn what the old prophets heard from God, and then they would teach it. They would explain it to people. So the scribes in Jesus' day, the scribes, the teachers of the law, these were people who did not necessarily see themselves as hearing from God. They saw themselves as people that were sort of guarding the works and the writings of those who had. Does that make sense? So a scribe was teaching people what prophets had taught. To teach somebody something that God is saying, something new, meant you had to have some kind of authority from God to say that. And this word authority was a big word. So a prophet was someone with authority. And you just think about that word authority, it means like you have the right to say what you're saying. Well, how do you have the right to say something new, something that's not in the Bible? Well, it's because you're a prophet, you're hearing from God. And at the time, there weren't any. So when Jesus shows up, first, he kind of looks like a scribe because he's reading and teaching. He goes into synagogues like they would do, and he opens up the scrolls and reads it and comments on it. But then he goes further, and he starts to actually say, but this is what I want to say about this. You've heard it said, but I say. And people are like, wow, who is this that teaches with authority? Like a prophet has now come among us. And this was a big deal because they hadn't really seen any. Now, John the Baptist, obviously, but that right there, John and Jesus were kind of like, no one at that point had probably seen or heard from a prophet in their entire lifetime. So it was a big deal. And for Jesus to come and speak with authority and to say, I'm not just wanting to tell you what old prophets said, I'm bringing you something new that I'm saying. That was a big, big deal. So Jesus obviously, and along with prophets, there's often signs and wonders and miracles. Holding power accountable was a big deal to prophets. And Jesus does all of these things. So that's what a prophet was in the Old Testament, and obviously Jesus himself was a prophet. He was more than a prophet, but he was a prophet. He was more than a teacher, but he was a teacher, right? Okay. But then the New Testament, the New Covenant church begins. The Christianity as a new way of living and thinking begins. And we now have a shift because primarily, here's the big shift, and now I'm getting to the actual question you asked. An Old Testament prophet was the person who was actually hearing from God because they had God's Spirit. We see this throughout the Old Testament. The Spirit of the Lord would come upon someone and they would prophesy. They would either be a prophet or temporarily say what God was saying. So having the Spirit of God was necessary in order to fill this role of being a prophet. Guess what? In the New Testament, the Spirit of God is poured out on everyone. And Joel prophesied that would happen. The prophet Joel said, in the last days, God will pour out his Spirit on all people. And he even says, your young men, your children, your slaves, your women will dream dreams and prophesy. Like we're all going to have this ability to prophesy. So in the New Testament, things have shifted. So this role or thing you might call it like an office or like this job, this position of prophet has necessarily changed in the New Testament because you no longer have this one individual with the Spirit. Now everybody has the Spirit. So what you see in the New Testament is actually not just like the prophet, but in the New Testament, you talk about the gift of prophecy. Like there are lots of people, and Paul, you read Corinthians, and they're like getting together, like everybody's just prophesying because we need some order here, right? So Paul often speaks of prophecy being a gift, which is just the fact that you and I, because we have God's Spirit, can hear from God and we can listen to him and tell others what he's saying. And so there's the gift of prophecy, according to Corinthians, is part of the New Testament church. Maybe we could do a whole other podcast about gifts of the Spirit. Actually, you can go on YouTube and check out a whole talk I did on the gifts of the Spirit. I uploaded that to my page today. So there's more on YouTube if you want to know more about the gifts of the Holy Spirit or even who this Holy Spirit is. They're both on YouTube. So the New Testament has a different view on prophecy and prophets for sure, because we all are now filled with the Spirit and we all have the ability. We all have the same Spirit that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Samuel had. We all do. We have the same Spirit that Jesus had. He said, you would do greater things than me. Now, it's also true, though, that Paul references offices or positions in the church. And he says there are pastors, there are teachers, there are evangelists, and he lists prophets as one of them. And actually, when you're reading the New Testament, you see a few places where they refer to people as prophets. So it's kind of like, okay, so what's happening here? I don't want to build a monument around this of like absolute theology. This is what it means. This is truth. But I will say this. It does appear, looking at the scriptures in the New Testament and other resources, early first few century resources, that there were people who were considered prophets in the sense that, and I'm you're getting my opinion here. I'm trying to extrapolate here. If prophecy is a gift, maybe some people just had it more or had a greater level of it, that they were really like God had specifically called them. I think when you look at this thing Paul refers to as an office, it's almost like everybody has the ability to do these things, but some people are called to do it for their whole life. And maybe there are people who are sort of said like, hey, what God is calling you to is to really speak what he's saying to the world. So there were people in the New Testament called prophets. They were just kind of different than Old Testament prophets. The whole dynamic had changed. It wasn't political. They weren't leading the church. They weren't the only people that could hear from God, but they do seem to be people that God specifically called to give their lives to this order of service. What does that mean for today? I don't know that I can answer that question. There are a lot of different denominations and groups of Christians in the world today who would answer that question differently. The more charismatic groups might say, yeah, there absolutely still are people whose role is prophet. Less charismatic groups or groups that are really open to the Holy Spirit might say, no. Just, I don't think you can say prophets were only in the Old Testament because you see them in the New Testament. So you could say, well, maybe all that stuff kind of went away when the Bible was canonized. We don't need prophets anymore because we have the Bible. People make that argument. Maybe that's a whole other topic of discussion, cessationism, the leaving the gifts. I actually cover that. So if you go to my YouTube page, the Like Stars YouTube page, and go down under messages, you'll see one of the talks I gave on the gifts of the Spirit, where I talk about, are they gone? Are they still relevant for today? I believe that they are. I operate in some of the gifts of the Spirit that are listed in Corinthians. Hope that doesn't weird you out too much. I definitely believe they're for today, but I also don't think there's something to push and fight over personally. I'm kind of whatever about it. So is it possible that there are still people who operate in prophetic gift? I believe so. Are there Old Testament prophets walking the earth today? I don't think so. But that's kind of more my opinion. So that was a long answer, but it was a good question. So hopefully that helps. And again, check out my YouTube page for more on that under the messages section on the Holy Spirit. Let's do another question. Number 2, is it okay to be a Christian and not be a Republican? Well, is it okay to be a Christian and not be a Republican? Man, there are a lot of different ways I could start answering this question. Let's pick the easiest one, which is logically, let's create a little logical flow here. If you have to be a Republican to be a Christian, I would want to know what the millions and millions, billion of human beings that followed Jesus before the Republican Party was founded in the United States of America were. Right? There are about 1 billion Christians on the planet right now. And I mean, maybe 50 million of them live in America where we have what is called republicanism. So if you have to be a Republican to be a Christian, then everybody that lives in China is what, not a Christian? Clearly, logically, I mean, I get what this person is saying. I think they know that any rational person, no, of course, there's nothing about republicanism in the Bible, so how could that be in any way related to Christianity? Now, to nuance that question a bit, though, to dig a little bit deeper, would be to say, living in America, okay, let's talk about people living in America who are part of the American political system. as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, should I lean Republican or does it matter? And that's maybe a little bit different of a question and probably more where this person was going. So I would say first and foremost, biblically speaking, what makes you a Christian is faith in Jesus and commitment to him. So if there's something about a political issue that is related to your faith in Jesus, then it's a Christian issue. So if there's a topic or an issue that you're talking about politically, and remember, to say that Jesus wasn't involved in politics is to just not read the Bible. Of course he was involved. Like politics, the word politic is from the Greek of community or city or people. Like politics are how people live together, and Jesus cares about how people live together. So there are always going to be issues that we quote unquote call political that are related to our commitment to Jesus. Now, does that mean you have to vote a certain way or whatever? That's dicier, but don't think that because you're a Christian, politics don't matter. I would say, though, that when I say the word politics, it's such a loaded term in this current American system where it's like right versus left, red versus blue. Politics by itself is just how people relate to each other, how we get along as a society, and God cares about that. So there will always be issues that are in the political sphere that are relevant to your commitment to Jesus. Now, that also being said, then let's keep moving. So there definitely are political issues that are relevant to Christians, because this issue that I'm called to vote on or cast a thought of or say something about is related to my faith in Jesus, and that's what it means to be a Christian. What I would say is it's a bit of a red herring or it's false a little bit to say that all things in politics that connect with Christianity are in the Republican side. And over here on the liberal Democrat side are all the stuff of the devil. Sometimes it can almost feel that way, if I'm just being honest, because it does feel like so many Christians are on the right and so many people that are opposed to Christians seem to gravitate towards the left. But let me unpack that box a little bit for you. That doesn't mean it's what it should be. Okay, it doesn't mean what that means. What it very well could mean is that human beings naturally gravitate towards each other. So when you see your people, your clan over on one side, you're like, oh, I belong over there, and you head that direction. So because some Christians are over here on the right, other Christians are like, oh, I guess I got to go over the right. And because people are like, well, I'm not a Christian, and Christians are on the right, so I guess I'll go over here to the left. That's kind of how human beings behave. Let's be honest, we've been doing it since middle school, right? So the problem with that is we bunch together with our clan, with our people, and we put ourselves in these two camps. And in doing so, we're forced to accept everything that camp offers me and reject everything the other camp offers me. But that's lunacy. It's ruining our country. It's not good for how we should be functioning as a society. Rather than saying, well, my clan is over here on the left, so I'm only going to believe what's true of the left, and I'm going to reject everything on the right. Or all my Christian friends are on the right, so I'm going to move over to the right, and everything Republicans believe, I'll believe, and everything Democrats believe, I will say comes straight from the pit of hell. There are things that Democrats believe that I think are from the pit of hell. You know what? There are things Republicans believe that I think are from the pit of hell. And that makes me step back and say, how am I actually approaching all of this? Am I making some assumptions that aren't necessarily true? What would be a better thing to do is to critically think and analyze each individual issue for itself and not say, well, my side thinks this, so that's what I think. There's Tim Keller has released some really great work that he's done with another author. I can't remember his name. The book, I think, is Destroyer of the Gods. Keller didn't write it, but he references it. And the idea that looking at the New Testament early church, he found 6 things that were seemed to be political realities of the Christians. And he definitely saw a respect for life. He saw, some of the things, a sexual ethic, things that are traditionally on the right today. But he also saw social justice and care for the poor and care for immigrants, things that feel more left. And then in some ways, maybe what we need to do is we need to step back and say, rather than just buying wholesale into one political party, should I be just analyzing each individual issue? And let me throw this curveball at you. If you haven't traveled, which it's okay, if you go across the sea to Europe, especially England, you'll actually find that it's kind of reversed. The Christian position over there is big government programs, welfare, and all the atheist non-Christians are on the side of big government. So again, I'm not saying, well, that's right and we're wrong, they're right, we're right, whatever. I'm just saying, like, it's human nature to put ourselves in camps. I want to be always transparent with you guys as well and tell you, I do consider myself a pretty conservative person. I would say I tend to vote more Republican. And part of the reason for that is because there are some core issues that really matter to me. And they outweigh other things, I guess you might say. Where my brain lands on that, though, is I acknowledge it. I prioritize these issues and have to vote that way. But I also want to say I don't like it all the time. I don't like that I'm forced to always think that everything on the left is wrong and think that everything on the right is good. I don't think everything on the right is good. I think there are problems with how we think sometimes in republicanism. And I think there are good things on the left. But again, we just do that. We want to completely demonize our opposition, accept everything our camp says is true. And that doesn't really make us healthy people. It just, I don't know, I think it blinds us. So I want to be a critical thinker about every issue and break each individual issue down. Not say, well, this is what Republican thinks, I think. This is what Democrats think. No, let's talk about an issue and let's break it down. And I think bringing this whole podcast into home, that is wisdom. Wisdom is not just saying, well, I'm in this camp because, just don't want to be clear, because there is a camp that I want you to be in, and it's the camp of loyalty and commitment and faith in Jesus. But that camp doesn't color itself red or blue. It cares about things that are red and it cares about things that are blue in this country. It is upset and against some things that are red and some things that are blue. And you got to be careful with that. And maybe it's a little bit more on one side, or maybe there's some bigger issues that currently in our country lead us to say, because of these things, I'm definitely voting this way. And that's cool. And I'm with you. That's how I am. But I don't buy it all wholesale. And yes, I think a person can be a Christian and be a Democrat. To say otherwise is to undermine salvation by faith alone, in my opinion, which we've covered before. All right. Hey, let's keep going. Now, those are two great questions. We got 10 more. How about this one? Number 3. What does it mean to drink the cup in an unworthy manner and to examine ourselves when taking the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, 27 through 28? Okay. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul is writing to the church in the city called Corinth. And if you read the letter to Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it reads kind of like a list of topics. Paul kind of is like, well, I've heard about this and you asked me this. It's almost like he's far away and he's hearing things, but he's also getting questions. So he writes these letters. Let me address this. Now let me address this. Now let me address this. And after addressing some other things, he comes to this topic of and there's different words for it. The Lord's Supper, sometimes we call it communion. The special word is Eucharist, the new grace. But basically, the Lord's Supper. So in all 4 gospel accounts, before Jesus goes to the cross the night before he dies, he gathers his disciples together and they have a meal and he breaks the bread and he takes this wine and he says, I want you guys, when you gather together, to do this in remembrance of me, to gather regularly and break bread and do it, remember, this is the blood of my new covenant, he says. Now, those are important things, and they come to play here. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul is addressing the church and some problems he sees, and he brings up this idea that the Lord's Supper, their communion, wasn't being done properly, and there's some issues with it. So let's unpack it a little bit, okay? First of all, let's talk about what Paul is really concerned with. The thing that Paul is the most concerned with when you read 1 Corinthians, and you get into 8, 9, 10, he brings up in 11, he talks about how they're gathering for the Lord's Supper, and it talks about how some are sort of like left on the outside and how some are like eating even before others can arrive, and there's not enough for other people, and some people are even getting drunk at it. He's kind of like addressing all this. Like, what's happening? Well, there's a lot that's happening, and that's why Paul is talking about it. The first thing that's happening is this thing that we call the Lord's Supper, they called it a love feast sometimes, was not sitting in church and taking a little sip of juice and a little tiny wafer and putting it in your mouth. It was literally a meal. They would sit down and eat together. And that, I can't overstate what a big deal that was, because in the ancient Greco-Roman culture that they lived in, eating with people was a social issue. Eating with people was like being seen with certain people said something about your social status, and social status was a big deal. So when people would gather together and sit and eat, whoever the people that you invited to your house, the people that you let sit at your table said something about you. And if they were way below your station, you were actually embarrassing yourself. And having people that were important at your table made you look better. So you wanted to be seen with the right people. You wanted to have the right image about yourself. Nothing's changed, obviously. But this was the way. So when this idea of the Lord's Supper or the love feast or the Eucharist is introduced to the Christian church, it has this like thing underneath it that is, it's a challenge, because everybody was invited to the table. Everybody. So if you're like a senator, right? You're the most important person in the whole community. You walk around and people bow to you, and you went to a Lord's Supper at a Christian community, there might be a slave sitting next to you. Women, like poor people, like homeless people were sitting at the table with you. Yeah, right? So you actually, if you were, you had to like die to yourself a little bit in these moments, because God was bringing humans together. He was trying to break down these social barriers and things. And this idea of meeting together and eating at the table with people who were different denominations, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different social economic statuses, men, women, all this kind of, Paul says these things are coming down. There's one people in Christ now. And so to sit at this table and eat this together was a sign that you were willing to lower your station and love and accept others because Jesus did, because Jesus made himself nothing and took the form of a slave. So part of the beauty of these meals was the way they would undermine all the social constructs of the day. But in this church in Corinth, that wasn't happening. The rich and powerful were basically having their little club and not even letting in or inviting the poor people. They'd let them in after they were eating, or they were just turning an opportunity to get drunk and party and whatever. Or they would eat all the good food before. Some commentators think that if you're kind of well-to-do, you don't work very hard, and you could show up in the afternoon and start eating and drinking. But the person who has to till his field till dark just to survive shows up late and all the food's gone. And Paul's like, you are completely missing the point here. You have so gone off the rails that you're turning this into a party or just a chance to elevate your social standing. This was never about this was to undo your social standing. This was to undo the walls and the barriers that keep people apart. The whole point of what God is doing here is bring people together. So if you are not honoring the other people who can't make it, you need to wait for them. And you need to make sure the lowest of the low person has a seat at your table. Otherwise, you are undermining what Jesus did for you. That's a big deal. Okay? So that was the first thing Paul was attacking. It was a social issue. And Paul was saying Jesus cares about the social dynamics of this. But then along with that was also this idea of covenant. When Jesus took the blood, he said, this is the blood of a new covenant. And this is important too, because a covenant is an agreement. A covenant is the word covenant or testamentum, where we get the word testament. It can mean treaty. It can mean contract, agreement. Oftentimes a testament was written down. Today we go to lawyers and we have testaments or covenants written to talk about what we want to do with our money when we pass away, or if you buy a business, you create a contract for it. This was very common part of the world. And so in the Old Testament, we see that God made a covenant. God made an agreement with these people known as the Jews. And the agreement was he would be their God. We talked about this before. They would be his people. And in exchange for blessing and all these things, they were to obey him, to treat him as God, for him to be the only God, have no other gods before him. That was the agreement. That was the arrangement. And the sign or the symbol of the agreement was, it's central. It was this thing called circumcision. We touched on that on our last podcast a few weeks ago. But there were all kinds of things that became known as works of Torah. So what you would or wouldn't eat, how you would or wouldn't cut your hair, not working on the Sabbath, all kinds of external things that you did that were ultimately about showing the world around you that you had accepted the covenant, that you had said yes to it. So you chose to circumcise your children. You chose to not eat pork. You chose to engage in certain activities or avoid certain things because you wanted to show that you had said yes to the covenant, that you were that you were part of this agreement. That was that. You're like, I'm saying yes, I'm still in, I'm buying in. But in the New Testament, the new covenant, Jesus implements a whole new agreement between humans and God now through Jesus, and it's through his blood. And this new agreement is we're not gonna base everything on what you don't eat. This new covenant is not going to be based on what days of the week you work or don't work or things like that, not how you cut your hair. This agreement is going to be based upon faith in Jesus alone, the living embodiment of the law. Okay, I know that was a lot. But what I'm getting at then, where this lands is, the way that you show you're in, the way that you accept this. In the Old Testament, they would say that you accept the yoke of Torah. The yoke was this thing you'd put on an oxen to help steer them when they were plowing. You sort of put it on and say, I accept the covenant and I'm going to obey it and do what it says. And the sign that you were obeying it and doing what it said is you obeyed Torah. You did what the Torah taught you to do, what the law said to do. But in the new covenant, the sign or the symbol is obedience to Jesus, that he is Lord, that he is King, and you are going to obey and live for him. So when Jesus forms a new covenant with his followers the night before his death and says, take this cup, break this bread. This is my blood poured out for you for a new covenant. Do this in remembrance of me. In essence, this thing we call the Lord's Supper or Communion Eucharist is not something that saves you. It's not something that makes you a Christian. But it is something you do as a sign that you have accepted the agreement, that you've bought into the new covenant agreement, that you have put your faith in Jesus and you are willing to be loyal and faithful to him and obey him. So here's Paul saying, listen, first of all, if you're not doing the meal the way that God wants you to, which is honoring other people who are beneath you and all these things, you're completely missing the point of what it means to be a follower and faithful to Jesus. But second of all, if you're not following Jesus in other ways, if you're not actually loyal to him, then why are you doing this symbol of having said yes to a covenant? Why are you doing this thing that shows that you've made an agreement that you haven't actually made? So when Paul says to the people, don't take it in an unworthy manner, he's not saying, it's not like, hey, if you've got any sin in your life, if you've made any mistakes or anything wrong, do not drink that grape juice or you'll go to hell. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, hey, examine why you're doing this. Before you keep doing this, just think about a little bit why it is that you're doing. What are you trying to get out of this? And I think that's where it really hits home when he says, examine yourself. Why are you celebrating this new covenant agreement? Are you celebrating it because it's just something to do? It's just like, whatever, yeah, fine. It's just some ritual you go through? Or when you take that cup and you take that bread and you drink it and you eat it, are you celebrating and affirming and remembering that you said yes to Jesus, that he is Lord of your life, that you have heard his offer of life to the fullest in exchange for faith in him, and you said yes to it? And every time you do that, whether we do it here in church or wherever you do it, you're affirming and you're saying yes all over again. That is what it means to take it in a worthy manner, I believe, to make sure that we're loving others the way that Jesus did, but also that when every time we take it, we're reminding ourselves that we have said yes to Jesus. Now, I've said this before on this podcast, and trust me, you're going to hear it again because it's a big deal. I'm always going to reiterate, there's a difference between faith and perfection. Faith is a word that means trust or loyalty. I might do a whole podcast just on that. There's stuff on my YouTube channel about it. But it doesn't mean perfection. You can have faith and be faithful without always being perfect. God is not looking for perfection from his followers. He's looking for faithfulness. He's searching the earth looking for faith, which is loyalty, is trusting God, saying, God, I'm coming after you. Even though I'm imperfect, even though I make mistakes, I'm with you, I'm holding on to you, I want what you have for me, I'm going to try. And when you take the cup and you drink it and you think about the broken body of the bread, you're thinking about the fact that, number one, his broken body paid the price for you to come back to God and have a relationship with him, to receive his spirit. The sacrifice of Jesus purifies us as temples, that we can once again be homes of God's presence. And so I'm reminding myself that I'm a new creation. I'm reminding myself that I have new life. I'm reminding myself of all the blessings that I receive because of Jesus and his sacrifice. But I'm also reminding myself of what he asks of me, because he does ask something of you. I am completely opposed and reject all messages of Christianity that want to argue that nothing is required of you as a human being. The Bible is 100% clear. There is something required of you as a human being. Faith. And faith is not nothing. Faith is something. Faith is trust, it's commitment, it's loyalty. That's what God wants from you. So the blood and the juice or the wine and the bread symbolizing his body and his blood remind us that we don't have to be perfect, that he's not looking to make sure we do everything exactly right, that we can make mistakes. But they also remind us that we've said yes to an agreement with our God, that we will be loyal to him, that we will return to what we were created for, what we were made for, by giving our loyalty and our allegiance to King Jesus and following him and doing what he calls us to do. So to do anything less would be to take the elements in an unworthy manner, to hate our brothers and sisters, to be mean to people, to be a jerk, to put yourself better than them and then go, take communion is to miss the point. And to have no real intention of serving God or being faithful to Jesus, but sitting in church and just drinking grape juice, you're just wasting your time. At best, it's wasting your time. At worst, it's just honoring God. And if you haven't said yes to the agreement and you're not striving to live it out, don't do it. And that would be, I love how Pastor Brandon here at Rise City, this last week we did it. The way that he put it was basically, if you're not a follower of Jesus, you're not invited, but you are invited to come follow Jesus. That door is always open. And if you want to, by all means, join us. But if you're not, this isn't for you. And I think that's the way we should look at it. It's a symbol of our faithfulness. All right. Well, this has been fun. This has been a great podcast. Hopefully you've enjoyed it and got something out of it. Look forward to just walking through your questions. As we continue together, I'm probably going to have some other topics I want to cover. I'm really wanting to, I think I'm about doing something both, a lot of questions about end times and creation, a lot of questions about faith and works we might come back to. So there's a lot of different things we might touch on. But again, just so you know, if you're looking for more, and the reason I'm doing all of this is just to give you resources. The podcast, the YouTube channel I opened has a lot of different videos on different topics. I've been teaching for a while. I've been a professor at 2 colleges, Christian colleges. So there's just a lot of things that I've been able to record and throw out there. So if you're looking for more, if you're looking for other things, check that out. Subscribe, like podcast, the YouTube channel, all that kind of stuff. And share it. Feel free to share anything that you need to. If you have any questions, if anything I said was confusing or you're like, wait a minute, I don't understand that, please email me, pete@risecitychurch.com. Go on likestars.us, go to my social media, anything, I don't know, go to the YouTube page and put in a comment. I want to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you're thinking, what you're wrestling through. I'd love to hear how you're processing some of this stuff. And I want to be a resource to you. If you have questions, if you're worried about something, wondering about something, if something I said was confusing, I want to help. Maybe it's by answering the podcast or me just emailing you back, which I've done over the last couple of weeks. A lot of times it hasn't been me bringing things on the podcast. It's just been me responding to people, getting lunch with somebody, emailing them back, whatever, when they've had questions. So please reach out to me. Check out the YouTube channel, check out the website, whatever. But talk to me. Let me hear from you. Leave a comment. Jump on Facebook and just tell me what you liked or what I could do different or any questions you might have. And as always, feel free to share us with your friends. So thanks again for joining. We will be back next week with another episode and continue to walk through your questions and see what God does through it. All right, everyone. Have a great week and look forward to talking to you.
Consume me and I burn alive when you're near.